Gwen Cherne is an Australian war widow following the death of her husband to suicide in 2017. She has provided essential advocacy for all Australian war widows and serving families living with mental issues. Family's perspective, Gwens Story. Please welcome Gwen Cherne.
Thanks to Karen and the team for inviting me to speak today. I think my story will provide that life experience that we've been hearing about all day. Today it will resonate with the research that we've seen and the fact that while we've been talking a lot about families, there's still a gaping need to look at supporting our families when we talk about supporting veterans. Excuse me. I'm Gwen Cherne. I'm a war widow. I'm also the mother of a currently serving member of the Australian Army. I don't wear a uniform. I never have, but I know the sacrifices of war. I carry the burden of service every day. Both my grandfathers, my father, my uncles, and 2 of my cousins have all served in the military. My father has post-traumatic stress, and we didn't realize that until 2 years ago. He no longer has contact with one of my brothers and doesn't know most of his grandchildren. My husband lost his life in service. The service of these men and women has impacted every member of my extended family. And yet, I stand here proudly that our eldest son, Tom, carries on a long tradition of service in the Australian Army. He's Lance Corporal Tom, as of today. I spent 3 years of my own life working in and out of Afghanistan. I lived in Kandahar city and Kabul and Jalalabad. For the most part, I didn't live behind the wire of a military base. I was in Tarankot, Zabul, Bamiyan, Wardak, and a few others. Very interesting provinces, if you ask me. I fired a Barrett sniper rifle with a little help from those who will not be named. I served in my own way. I served by helping rebuild what the war took from the people of Afghanistan. I walked through markets on my own, handed out goats to villagers, visited schools we built, and walked through rural towns collecting my own data. I felt the dust in my lungs. I feared IEDs on the roads when we traveled. I lost mates and loved ones and sent them home in herks or in urns. I ultimately had to leave Afghanistan, not because of any trauma I experienced there or anything I had seen, but because my anxiety and stress levels got the better of me, and because the fault lines from my childhood trauma were triggered there. As some of you know, I met my late husband, Pete, while I was in Afghanistan. When I met him, he was a security contractor who had served in Cambodia and East Timor. Though he was out of the Army, he missed it. So after we married in 2010, Pete re-enlisted. I quickly found myself serving again, this time the Australian Army, as a wife and mother. Life was never easy with Pete. His mental health struggles were always apparent, and I was in therapy from 2011 to help manage my life with him. But in 2016, our relationship and our lives changed forever, when whilst on deployment in Iraq, Pete had a stroke. He never recovered, yet no one could tell by just looking at him. It was my burden to bear. His suffering was our suffering, and it was just something I would have to manage the rest of my life. I had no support at the time except my therapist and my knowledge from my own bachelor's degree in psychology, and that wasn't enough. I looked for safe support but couldn't find it or didn't want to access it for fear of it damaging his career. Frankly, I didn't know what I needed to do as a family member to support my husband and his healing. Pete's poor mental health impacted his career, despite hiding it as best he could. He hid behind his identity as a Special Forces soldier because it was the one thing that he loved being above all other things. For us, this meant he wasn't ready to give up being a soldier, even though that may have been the best thing for him and for us. Pete was angry, depressed, anxious, paranoid, and he was violent with me. So I spent the last year of his life managing him, just like I had the 5 years prior, protecting the kids, protecting his career, and bearing the costs of his service. There are many families out there doing just this right now as I speak. My husband, Sergeant Peter John Cave of the 2nd Commander Regiment, died by suicide on the 6th of February, 2017. He was one of Australia's most elite soldiers. In the days prior to his death, we had an argument on the Friday because I asked him to go and get help. He got violent and I had to leave. He proceeded to play golf on Saturday with some of his best mates, and on Monday morning at 0600 hours, he ended his life. He was found by members of his unit in our home. In the end, despite everything, Pete felt completely alone and helpless. But he wasn't. I've thought a lot about it over the last 2 years and realized that despite everything, I never would have left him. I thought staying was the best way to protect my children. And I loved him too much. I'll admit that I wanted to save him from his demons and from his pain, but I couldn't save him. He knew what it would take. He knew what resources were out there. He taught mental health first aid. He helped so many others, but he wasn't able to do the work to save himself. As it turns out, the greatest enemy he would ever face was his own stigma about mental health. He just couldn't bring himself to ask for help and then show up. I've spent the last 2.5 years of my life working tirelessly to raise awareness and the stigma around mental health, learn about suicide prevention and postvention, trauma and grief. And the one thing I've learned above all else is that Pete wasn't beyond help. He was difficult and really hard to live with. But if he had been able to put his hand up and do the work, he'd still be here. I say this knowing that when Australians take a survey about mental health in the workplace, so there's recently been a survey in one of our organizations, and 80% of the people in this organization believe that we need more support for mental health. But when you ask those same people if they want to work with someone who has a mental health issue, less than 40 of them say yes. So we want people to get help? Yes. We want more services? Yes. But don't put them on our teams, please. The stigma is truly alive and well. As we know, the pain does not start or end when a suicide happens. It just cascades down to those around them and then to those left behind. Our eldest son, Tom, lost the person in the world he loved the most. No one will ever be able to fill those shoes. Our 7-year-old daughter, Emily, who was Daddy's little princess and the apple of his eye, said to me recently, "Mommy, I should have told Daddy that I wanted him to get help because then he'd still be here. If only baby girl." Sadly, she'll always carry with her the idea that she wasn't enough, and I will have to help her manage that the rest of her life. She's in therapy once a week to help manage her emotions and her anxiety. Our 4-year-old son always gets me. My blue-eyed, golden-haired Lockie, who's the spitting image of his father, spent the night in hospital recently. He's fine, but he just wanted his dad. He needed love and reassurance that only Pete could give him, to know that everything would be okay. I had to do that on my own, and lots of women do, especially in this community, but it still wasn't right. 2.5 years on, and Pete's death is still raw in so many ways. I still find myself in pain every single day. No one said it would be easy, but no one said it would be this hard. I should have brought a tissue. The damage done is bigger than I could have ever imagined. As you may know, as most of you know, grief impacts every part of your life. They used to think that grief shrunk over time, but now they've realized, thank you. Doesn't matter how many times I share this. But now they've realized that you just grow around it. So the pain doesn't lessen, but you grow. 1.6% of the Australian population put on a uniform in service of this country. And almost half leave the military with a mental, moral, or physical injury that will shape the rest of their lives and the lives of their families for years to come. Veterans have almost twice the suicide rate of civilians, and to add insult to injury, children who lose a parent to suicide are 2 to 3 times more likely to die by suicide or attempt suicide. We lost 85 veterans to suicide here in Australia in 2017, and more than 150 in the last 18 months. 2 current serving members this week. This pales in comparison to statistics in the US, but hits our community and this nation very hard. When I first started sharing my story, I thought that Pete would be seen as a coward, and his service wouldn't be valued the same as all the men and women who've lost their lives in combat or in training. I believe this even though we lose 1 veteran to suicide every 4 days. There is something about what we ask these men and women to do. We have an obligation to make sure they have every resource at their fingertips to heal whatever wounds, seen or unseen, they may have. We can do more. We must do more. We will do more. And here this week, we are doing more. I like to think of myself as a fairly highly functioning human being. Some may disagree. But what most people don't know is that my grief, the trauma from Pete, and my work these past 2.5 years has taken its toll on me. I was sick for 5 months this year. I worked through a lot of it, but I don't actually have a full-time job right now because I needed to stop working. I needed to take time for me to focus on taking care of myself and letting myself heal this year. I've been able to do that because there are organizations here in Australia that support families like mine. I've had the space and time to start to heal, to take a breath, to focus on my kids and my own mental health. I could have easily lost hope when Pete died, but I didn't. I wanted others to learn from what happened to us, to understand mental health doesn't discriminate. Even those with the strongest mental fortitude can become a victim. I wanted to demonstrate hope in the face of extreme adversity. I wanted to show that by being vulnerable, we can actually live deeper, more meaningful lives. But I needed support to be able to do that, and I still do. As you can see, I am still an open, gaping, seeping wound. A pretty cool one, but still an open, gaping, seeping wound. But that doesn't mean that I'm not healing. In my dark and difficult moments, I am building resilience, slowly, 1 step at a time. Since I can remember, my life has been about serving others, my community, my school, those living in poverty and in strife-torn regions. My family instilled in me the idea that a life worth living is one in which you serve others. So I force myself to tell this story because it has to be shared. I have to share my sorrow because too many families out there are feeling the effects of post-traumatic stress and are still uncounted statistics. We still have a lot of work to do to reduce the stigma, the fear, and ultimately the lives lost because of the unacknowledged burden of service on our serving men and women and their families. I miss my husband desperately. My marriage wasn't perfect, but I hate that my children don't have their father and are forgetting him. I don't particularly miss the living nightmare that was my life when he was alive. But I don't wish the pain and agony that we now have on anyone. My story is but one of hundreds, thousands even. Because behind every serving man and woman is a family who not only is there to support them, but one that is impacted by their service as well. Even now, when veterans are getting support for post-traumatic stress and other mental health issues, at first families think that is enough, but it isn't. Families need our own support. We need to educate ourselves about post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, whatever the issue may be. And then we need support to help us cope, sleep, exercise, manage, and then heal the impact of that mental health issue on the entire family. I know families are getting more lip service, and here this week we're seeing that they're actually at the focus point. But I beg of you to keep adding "and families" every time you say the word veteran, and then to make that mean something in whatever research, policy, services, or work you do. I'm a widow, yes, but now I'm also the mother of a serving member. Please don't forget all of us. Thank you.